Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for joining us for Black Reflections. It's the first of 3 conversations on racial justice in music. My name's Chichi Nwanuku and I'm based here in London. I'm a double bassist and the founder of the Chineke Foundation. It's a foundation that provides career opportunities to established and up-and-coming Black, Asian and ethnically diverse classical musicians in the UK and Europe. Our organisation aims to be a catalyst for change, realising existing diversity targets within the industry by increasing the representation of Black, Asian and ethnically diverse musicians in British and European orchestras. I was a founder member and principal double bassist of the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment for 30 years, and I'm a professor of double bass historical studies at the Royal Academy of Music here in London. Before I introduce our expert panelists, I'd like to take a moment just to talk to you a little bit about this project. Black Reflections is a three-part panel discussion. It's a series on racial justice in music. And over the course of the last 3 months, we've all been pushed to re-examine the role of race in every aspect of our lives. There's a dire need for us to have a conversation as a society about the role of race and racism. And the field of classical music is no exception. In fact, I think it's one of the most needy. This series will focus on the legacy of Black artists in classical music, the personal experiences of Black musicians, and whether we dare to imagine a fairer future for Black artists, where conversation topics like this will no longer be relevant or even necessary. Our panelists represent an enormous range of perspectives as Black artists, scholars, activists, and executives in music. Tonight, our focus will be primarily on the contributions of Black artists and the social and historical context for Black artists' participation in classical music. I'd love to introduce our panel now and ask each of them to say a few words about themselves. So I'm joined today by the acclaimed classical and jazz pianist, Aaron Deal. Aaron.
Chi-Chi, thank you very much. My name is Aaron Deal, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, and currently based in New York City.
Thank you. Our next panelist is no stranger to this industry, and he's a giant in his work of shining a light on diverse talent in classical music. He inspired me so much when he first invited me to be part of Sphinx about 12 or 13 years ago. And he's continued to encourage me to create something similar here in the UK, hence Chineke. He's the Sphinx Organisation founder, MacArthur Fellow, and multidisciplinary artist and executive, Aaron Dworkin. Welcome, Aaron.
Hi, Chi-Chi, how are you? Hello, everyone. It is absolutely great to be able to join everyone. And of course, an honor to always be able to do any project with you, Chi-Chi. I founded Sphinx, and about 5 years ago, transitioned to the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, where I served as dean for several years, and now for a couple of years, I'm on faculty teaching arts entrepreneurship and arts leadership. So very, very much looking forward to what I think will be informative and potentially provocative conversation.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So next, I'd like to welcome a professor in the Department of Music History at the Juilliard School in New York, Dr. Fredara Hadley. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to be here. I am an ethnomusicologist by training, and I say was because I don't get to play as much as I once did, but violist and classical pianist as well. And I'm super just grateful and excited to be in dialogue with you all and learn and listen and share thoughts as well over this really important and always timely topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Fedora. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce the president of the Society for American Music and professor of musicology at Miami University, Dr. Tammy Kernodle. Welcome, Tammy.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And I'm so excited about this conversation and excited to be in a space with people whose work I've admired from afar. I am in Miami, in Ohio, the real Miami, but I am originally from Danville, Virginia, the home of Camilla Williams. And I am happy, very excited to be here.
Thank you. Well, I think we're going to start with a format of a few questions, and I'll invite two of our panelists to discuss the questions, and then hopefully as time goes on, we'll just expand out and hopefully it'll just flow into a natural looking and sounding conversation, and hopefully we'll all get something out of it that's fresh and new to us all. So question number one, the burning question number one is, how have we determined and established what is and what isn't classical music? So can I throw that to Tammy and Fredara to start with, please? Because what I want to start with is how we determine it in academia and culture.
Tammy,
Fredara, are you going to?
I was going to say President Sam.
Well, okay. Well, I think what we have to look at is the way in which the study of music was established in American conservatories in the 19th century, and even how America's concert scene developed in the late 19th century in the 1880s, when orchestras, as we know of them as Western European orchestras, began to emerge as autonomous organizations. And how at that time, even though we had a robust a musical scene in America, a robust soundscape, we were still beholden to European concert artists and European composers in shaping that. And so from the very beginning, I think it's important that we understand we've never really until recently tried to forge a separate cultural identity in America in terms of concert music. It's been very much centered. And then when we push back from just looking at the concert aspects of repertory, we really have to look at the historiography and really how the history of music was taught, both through, in a historical framework from theory and our understanding of harmony and tonality, and also the cultural aspects of that music being taught, and how that was based in a Germanic model that for years was very composer centric. And so this idea has always been that classical music was music or art for the sake of art, right? And so it's always been centered in this idea that composers or master musicians progress the music in autonomy outside of any of the social or cultural environments that they operate in, and also without considering what they are tethered to musically, racially, or culturally. And so it's been very myopic in its construction. And that plays into every aspect of how this music operates, even in our current culture.
Wow, that's a lot of information there. Thank you. Because it makes me wonder about everything else that you had before the 19th century, which was rich in itself, and how you adapted, assimilated the Western art form, and then have. I mean, you've taken off in a major way since then with your 19th and 21st century composers, very much adapted what was going on in the West. And of course, America was made from people from Europe anyway, so it was kind of inherent in some sort of way. Is that how does that go with you, Fredara?
I basically amen everything Tammy just said. And what I would add to the foundations that she's building is that I think when we think about particularly how we define classical music, and the operational definitions of classical music are used in such a way and conceived in such a way that it minimizes Black participation in it. That does exist, right? And I think that's an important point to make, because it isn't that there was no participation by African Americans in classical music, extending at least back in the United States deep into the 19th century. It's not that those things were not happening, and before then, it's not that those things were not happening, it's that we don't bring them into the conversation when we talk about what classical music is. And so, for example, if we're thinking about the 19th century and building off how Tammy beautifully laid out the history of music education and sort of the establishment of orchestras and symphonies in the United States, we aren't thinking about the community practice of classical music in Black communities. We aren't thinking about institutions such as Oberlin, New England Conservatory, Juilliard, which have a long-standing history of African Americans attending those institutions. And because of segregation, they could not deeply penetrate the white world. And so they had to come back to the Black world and work at HBCUs or teach and become ministers of music in churches and pass on the knowledge that they gained, both from their folk traditions and from their classical traditions, to their communities, to their students. And so we have these things that exist all along, really, but we don't bring them into the conversation. We don't see them as worthy pedagogical models, these community practices of trained singers in communities, choirs in communities, who could not, again, because of segregation, oftentimes perform for anybody else but themselves, right? We don't bring that into how we think about, or the historiography of classical music. Even if you think about the Fish Jubilee singers, who are notable for how they take the melding of their folk traditions and classical music and kind of use it almost as a technology, as an apparatus of preservation and performance aesthetics. We don't really integrate that into how we think about classical music writ large in America. And they are performing primarily to white audiences, both in the United States and in Europe. So even though we know all of these things, we still treat it in a bifurcated manner that implies that those Black traditions of performing, composing, engaging classical music are less than or wholly separate from what is happening in the white compositional world and white classical world. And what the Fish Jubilee singers do is absolutely critical, because that act of preservation and development of unique performance aesthetics helps to set the stage for what Black composers do so much of in the early 20th century, drawing upon those reservoir, Harry T. Burleigh as well, drawing upon that reservoir of spirituals to start imagining and really honing what a Black compositional voice sounds like.
Gosh, yes, a lot of food for thought. Thank you. Aaron, so how does this all play out in performance practice? How does it look as performers?
Well, I actually wanted to just tag off what Fedara was saying just now and go back to Antonin Dvorak. And when he came to America, he had mentioned that America's language in classical music, the answer was in the folk traditions of this country, specifically Black folk traditions. And I had stumbled maybe a few months ago upon this podcast, this guy, Joseph Horowitz, I think his name is. And he's talking about why Black music in America, or Black composers in America, haven't been more celebrated. And he talks about a composer named William L. Dawson. Some people may be familiar with him. And there's a symphony that was very much celebrated. It was, I think, premiered in like 1934, 35, somewhere around there, with Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra. And the symphony is called the Negro Folk Symphony. And for whatever reason, and certainly systemic racism plays a major part in it, the symphony really never gained much traction, and now people are trying to revive it. One of the difficulties, especially coming from the approach of jazz music, where the language is very much rooted in an improvisational kind of oral tradition. When it comes to, I think, many classical musicians, and even speaking with some good friends of mine who are not jazz musicians, they really just don't understand what is needed or what is necessary in order to gain a greater knowledge of these very specific idiomatic nuances that are in the music, primarily because the music, the language is not prevalent in Mahler, it's not prevalent in Strauss or Brahms. So in essence, many, just I guess by default, don't view it as a necessity in order to gain further insight on the music that the repertoire that they're studying. And I suppose the answer to that, in a lot of times, is having more or allowing more composers and musicians to incorporate that kind of language in the music itself. We could call it classical music, whatever. Incorporating more of these idiomatic expressions in specifically American music. I know it can be a very different viewpoint if you're in Europe, and even someone like who's composer Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who was British, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, he's coming from, I think he might have even studied with Elgar. I mean, he's coming from a very different tradition. So, the idea of Black music, I mean, in America, that's a very specific thing. But when
I think Coleridge Taylor is he was born in Britain. He studied at the Royal College of Music. He started at the Royal College of Music at the same time as Vaughan Williams and Gustav Holst. Elgar was senior to them, but that he didn't teach him. But Elgar was already a big man, and he would have been influenced by it. But you can't see Coleridge Taylor's colour in his music necessarily, because he's British born and trained, and he did not have a Black community really. In fact, I think the first connection he had with Black musicians was when the Fisk Jubilee Singers first came to London, if you can imagine that. But I was just wondering whether some of what you were discussing regarding the sort of freedom and improvisation methods, I mean, they were going on in Europe in the 16th, 17th, in Baroque musicians, improvisation was very, very much a part of the language. And it's sort of beaten out of us, really. But Aaron Dworkin, Aaron D, I'm going to call you.
So, well, first, it's just such a phenomenal discussion. And as I expected, I am already learning a lot just from hearing everything that all of you are sharing. And of course, so many connections, and especially with Fisk coming over, I think in 1899, because one of the things that they sang was Troubled in Mind. And Samuel Coleridge Taylor ended up building the symphonic variations on an African air off of that, which is the basis of the big spoken word work that I've been doing. And so there's all these connections. And I think what I wanted to share kind of, and Chichi, going back to your comment about the practice, how is this kind of almost manifesting, which is that for me, I didn't know any of these composers growing up until I got to the University of Michigan. And that was after having previously been at Penn State and then out of school for 4 years before coming back. And so to me, the history is so important, but there are so many general people, but especially young people, including young people of color, who are not fully aware of this extraordinary history that we have and all of the amazing people who have made such important contributions to our art form that we're talking about. And so it reminds me of two things. So one, my own personal experience was I went into a lesson one day and my teacher, this is as an undergraduate student at Michigan, and my teacher saying, do you want to play music by Black composers? And my knee-jerk reaction being a little put off, because I was not aware there were any Black composers. And I was like, is he patronizing me, or what? Is there, are there real works? Is he creating some separate group of works for me to work at? Right? These deeply unfortunate and driven by my own ignorance of the repertoire that existed, these kind of knee-jerk thoughts. And of course, then he starts pulling all these works, obviously, composers we've mentioned, William Grant Still, et cetera. I'm like, oh my God, and start exploring and learning this whole world that I wasn't aware existed. Now, that was 20, 25 years ago. I do believe that we have moved the needle to some extent, but we certainly have not moved it enough, as evidenced by the fact that less than 1% of all the works performed by American orchestras, at least, are by any composer of color. And the lack of this knowledge within the administrative and artistic structures of orchestras, which prevents it from really evolving in any significant way or as fast as we would like it to. And so what that leads me to kind of the second point, which is that the systems that we can put in place, especially in our academic settings, that requires this history to be learned, not just because, oh, I would like to take this special class, on African-American music, or on the history of Black composers, but that understanding this isn't the history of Black composers, this is the history of classical music. This is the history of music. This is the history of instrumentalists. It's not just the history of Black instrumentalists. And incorporating that. And until we get that kind of systemic shift where the core curriculum in our academic programs incorporates this history, I fear we won't achieve what we ultimately want, as far as a full understanding of the true history, the full breadth of the history, which will also then affect what individual soloists, as well as, of course, orchestras perform today.
Thank you. That's amazing. We've had, do you know, Aaron, the first Black musician music that I ever played was when I came to Sphinx and played William Grant Still. So I had not studied anyone right through school, right through college. It was such my first time coming to see, that walking into the first rehearsal, I will never forget that feeling, because I had never experienced it. And there I was, a woman in my 40s, maybe even, yeah. But do you know what I mean? And I feel so cheated by that. And I cannot I cannot say how important it is, the work of having role models, which none of us had. We never had these role models. And so when your teacher presented to you, would you like to play music by, you felt you were being othered at that point, because traditionally we are taught that, in every industry, that, white is the norm and anything else is other. And so, and as a mixed race kid, where you're the only person who looks like the way you do, for all those years, you spend your we're so resourceful in trying to assimilate and be almost invisible, not wanting to draw any special attention to the fact that we look differently. And so this is the way we are taught. And I think what has happened in the last 25 years has been a massive knee-jerk upwards, that since you started Sphinx, and so many other, we're all like babies of Sphinx, really. But the thing is, we can't underestimate the power of a role model and the fact that we need to decolonize the educational system. We need to decolonize the curriculums in every subject. And so, so the next kind of question that was really about, historically, who gets to participate.
So can I say something to that? Because I think drawing on what everyone has said, and I think what we see in terms of what gets performed and what gets talked about is based on a very limited infrastructure and system. That's based on who is published, who is recorded, right? And who has access to performing or aggregations, right? That determines your viability as a composer. And ultimately that trickles down to who is actually in the pit or who's actually on the stage. And I think one of the things that has been a disadvantage in terms of Black composers is their access, the ability to finance publishing, the ability to convince publishing companies that their music was worth the investment, right? We see that even now with Florence Price. People act like Florence Price just sprang out of the earth somewhere, right? When Florence Price had such a long, varied, difficult career as a composer. And the reason why she's not a household name is simply because Florence Price did not have the financial means, nor did she have the cachet that William Dawson had, that William Grant Still had. And we can come back and talk about that gender thing if we got time for it. But she did not have the ability to have many of her works published. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why the Afro-American Symphony is not being performed that much now, because it's not in score. It's not in printed parts. If you look at it, most of it, I mean, people have done their own versions of it, you know what I'm saying? But if you look at the Norton Anthology of Music today, it is still in a handwritten manuscript form that William Grant Still produced back. And so we need to start talking about, like, we got to break the barriers on many levels, from those publishing companies to these performing aggregations and who's in the concert hall, to the history books, to the academy, right? There has to be a full-fledged attack, because we want to say to the academy, well, you're not teaching these people, but then what are our resources? And that also speaks back to us scholars, because, we are trained as scholars to write our dissertations, not based on what our interests are all the time. We're based on how valuable that's going to make us in the job market. And so for many of us who looked at Black composers or wanted to write on Black concert music, we were dissuaded from doing that kind of work, right? And so we had to do the work on the opposite side, not realizing that if we did that work adds to a historiography that then can transform the classroom space when needed. So it's a full frontal attack. Yes, that has to take place.
It has to take place, and we've got to, and at the moment things are happening, but in separate pockets. And that's something I'd like to talk about a little bit later on, about how we just progress the way we're doing things.
I just wanted to say one thing as well. Tammy, I was trying to get 7 Traceries by William Grant Still. And the only way I could get it was going directly through his daughter. It's on a website, but it's not like I can go to Shermer or Henley or any of these, big publishing companies, like you said, to get the music. I mean, Mary Lou Williams, you wrote a book on her. I mean, a lot of her music is not even available or published. And the guy who was head of her estate has since passed, so it's almost impossible to get anything of substance from her other than a few relatively popular works. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Well, people are working on Florence's manuscripts as we speak, thank goodness, and I think a lot more is going to be coming up now. So I know that, I'm a true believer that we have influenced every aspect of every genre of music, but I would love to hear a little bit more from you regarding the legacy of Black artists in classical music and how African diaspora musical traditions has impacted the classical traditions. And when I think about things, I immediately think about Beethoven, for example, and his not polyphony, his what's the word that begins with a P, his polyrhythms, and which is such a typical West African trait, and the pentatonic scale, it's so West African. But anyway, that's sort of littered everywhere. But how is it, jazz, blues, your, old time music. I'm not quite sure what you mean by old time music, but ragtime, rhythm and blues, hip hop, and we're coming all the way up to reggae, and Gershwin's influence, and how he grabbed onto the Scott Joplin, the jazz clubs, and all of the things that were going on in the heart of New York. The music that was coming out of New York sounded like New York itself, the city. You could hear the city when you hear music by New York composers, I always feel. What are your thoughts about the African diaspora's impact in our classical music?
Well, I think part of what happens with how, and I go back to this point of framing, we have a desire, largely because of the repertoire that we teach, to treat classical music as this pristine, precious sort of thing that is separate from the musics of the world, the musics in which it exists, if you're talking about the United States. And when I was listening to you speak of all of these different references, of course, Aaron Deal mentioned Dvorak earlier, and his experience here in the States, especially, and talked about Samuel Coleridge Taylor when Fitzgerald singers went to Europe and all of that. But also, I'm thinking about the work of one of the projects that I'm currently engaged on, which is the really understanding the life and the artistry of Shirley Graham Du Bois, who most people have never even heard of. And if they have heard of her, they only know her as the second wife of the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. But what we know is that from all indications, we think she was the first Black woman to compose an opera and stage it with a Black cast. And I think that the chorus in that opera may have had 250 people of community singers, largely community singers. Mm-hmm. And it was staged in 1932, right? And premiered, and to Tammy's point about the repetition of these things rarely happens. So Florence Price gets her premiere, William Dawson, William Grant Still, all between like 1931, 1934. Shirley Graham Du Bois sits in the heart of that in 1932. And it is so impossible for those works to be staged again. They get one flashy premiere and then that's it. And how you canonize things is through repetition, right? And same is true with Shirley Graham Du Bois's opera Tom Tom in 1932. And I was thinking about her in relationship to your question, because she sees opera as an ideal format to explore the relationship between Africa, the antebellum South, and Harlem in the 1930s. She sees opera as a way to put these ideas together, both ideologically and musically. And this is after she's lived in Paris and found a community of Francophone Africans who are teaching her and exposing her to the music of their country of origin. And she studied also at the Sorbonne with Nadia Boulanger, and she's come back to the United States and worked at a series of HBCUs, historically Black colleges, such as Morgan State College, then Howard University, and has found herself studying at Oberlin with the opportunity to really kind of expand on these ideas and incorporating both her classical music influences in terms of her operatic writing, but also Negro spirituals, the use of an expanded percussion section, sixth timpani, I think is what the opera starts with, right? To really kind of give the sound of African drumming. And the third act of the opera, set in Harlem in the 1930s, obviously you have jazz influences there, but it's the musical influences that we can point to, but it's also her attempt to reconstitute what she feels is a cultural lineage that's been diverted, not broken, but diverted. And so I point to her as sort of an exceptional example of that. But over and over again, you see Black composers, whether they are consciously, you have some who are consciously sort of wrestling with what it means to be Black in America, and that shows up in their music, but just seeing classical music as a valid form in which to imbue with their own sensibilities and their own ideas. And I just don't think that we see that as normative enough. that they are just as interested, just as capable as anyone else, as turning to our tonal system, turning to our compositional practices as a way to express whatever they find to be true is in the world. And there's a quote that is in the the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in the music exhibit, which I know Tammy worked very hard on and close on, that quote from Eileen Southern, which says, she can't imagine a time in which African and Black musicians would not have something to say to each other. And I would extend that to the world. And so just as we see music in just about any context, you know, people are creating because there's something to communicate. There's something to put out into the world. Black Americans, people in the diaspora are no different from that needing to express and seeing classical music as a viable form to communicate either a personal truth or a community truth. And again, going back to the diaspora, I just love what you're doing with Chineke and the UK, but also it makes me think about what I've seen in Ghana with their National Symphony Orchestra, with their Pan-African Orchestra, where they're taking their education and the work and the legacy of people like J.H. Kwabena and Ketia and his compositional legacy in Ghana, and really thinking about how to draw on some of the art music sensibilities that already exist on the ground there, taking his training and using that to articulate fully Ghanaian sentiments about the world that sort of remix what we know about classical music, both in visual sense and musical sense, in terms of the instruments in the ensemble we're going to perform in our local attire as opposed to our concert Black. All of those touches matter. And my hope is that the way we continue to expand how we talk about classical music allows for all of that idiosyncratic and local redetermining of what and reimagining of what classical music is and can be.
Absolutely. It's
So
there's a lot there. Aaron,
I'd like to jump in a minute, for a minute, because I think my sister really laid that out, if you don't mind. But I think what we are beginning to see is the product of a cultural call and response. And I look to two particular historical periods that my sister alluded to, but I want to go a little earlier, because I do think that we see the imprint on Western classical music beginning in the period of 1918 to 1921, when James Reese Europe goes to France with the Hellfighters Regiment, and you have composers that shape a sense of modernism in Europe, drawing on that. Ravel, for instance. I think we also hear that in what the Southern Syncopated Orchestra and Will Marion Cook did in England, and in the UK and Ireland, in their tour from 1919 to 1921. And what we start to hear are these real significant markers of sonic Blackness beginning to have an imprint on what these European composers are doing. And what these European composers are doing aligns with their acknowledgement that America, even though America itself is rooted in and tethered to this white supremacist notion of racialized sound being only white and only being legitimate if it's white. Europe and Asia is looking at and listening to these Black artists and what these Black composers are doing. And I think that even intensifies more during the period of 1942 to 1960, when we have not only World War II and jazz being mediated to Europe and to Asia, but we also have the State Department utilizing Black musicians and Black composers as part of Cold War propaganda, so that Julia Perry is going throughout Europe doing lectures on Black music and conducting orchestras and writing her own pieces, right? And so we see this lasting imprint that I think gets acknowledged in Europe oftentimes, but doesn't translate to what we say and what we do here in America. And so what Samuel Floyd referred to as that cultural call and response is very deep in classical music if we really acknowledge what that has been.
Right. You know, you're mentioning people I've never heard of. I've never heard of Julia Perry conducting in Europe.
She
I,
was
I
a
got
she
some
was
more.
a Black woman composer. Also taught at many HBCUs when she came back to America, because she could be celebrated in Europe and come back to America and have to deal with marginalization that
Yes.
was not only race based but gender based.
Same thing happened to your athletes. Yeah. When they came to the Olympics, won all the gold medals, came back and, um,
Well,
no,
this is, oh,
all
can
right.
I, just to kind of add on a little, and first of all, this is, you're taking me to school. This is
Yes.
awesome. Oh my gosh. Similar
Yeah.
to Chicha, just again, continue to learn every day. And that's also what's fascinating, is there's so much to learn. But to kind of, we were talking about some more historical figures, and we were also talking about Samuel Coleridge Taylor, but bringing it a little bit closer to some of our musicians for today. I also am thinking of Coleridge Taylor Perkinson. And it was actually the first commission that Sphinx did of the Symphony of the Sphinx, and brought him together with Nicky Giovanni, one of our unbelievable and amazing poets, to write the Symphony of the Sphinx, and hearkening back really the connection between African American women and Africa, and thinking about his use, for example, of percussion in the orchestra, right? And just bringing these sounds and that bridge, literally building that musical bridge in the piece, which was extraordinary. But again, kind of almost like what I was referencing earlier, but that connectivity, seeing, for example, young Sphinx musicians being able to interact with the piece, with him, thinking about Sanford Allen. And for those who may not know, first African-American in the New York Philharmonic, and one of the first African-Americans in a major American orchestra, and obviously left a legacy for our field. But not only that, when you're able to connect his life experiences and his artistic experiences with young musicians who are coming up, it is transformative, because it's not only informative of, hey, here's the history, and here's history you may not know, and or here's history that you were taught that was incorrect, either about our music or about some of these situations, but also the inspiration, the motivation that comes from that kind of interaction. And I've seen, just people who, so many musicians of color who have that legacy and have carried it on to young people. And now just seeing and imagining how that will be charted by Sphinx musicians, by Chineke's, right, musicians, just that, these stories, the legacy is being written today. And I would just kind of add that it's built on this extraordinary foundation. But that we are continuing it, and whatever we can do to further that and to empower that continuation, I think is important.
Yes, thank you. There's so many questions that are just flying up for me. For example, let me just try this one. So many of the music that I've been looking at that Chineke plays, from these composers that we've just been all talking about right now, a lot of the pieces begin with the word Negro, Negro symphony, Negro dances, Negro this, Negro that. Let's just talk about that for a second, because one of the things, well, I'll tell you, one of the things that we do when we play these pieces, we call them, we will drop the word Negro, and we will say African or something like that. And do you think, because the word Negro has become, it belongs to the N word, and do you think that is one of the reasons that people shy away from playing some of these pieces, because of the title? And what was the reason for all of these composers calling their, having to put that stamp of ethnicity on the title page of every other piece they wrote? Because there's a lot of pieces. Simon Courage Taylor, when he heard spirituals for the first time, he heard the Fifth Jubilee Singers singing all those spirituals in London, and then he wrote his own 12 melodies, and he calls them 12 Negro melodies. I don't think, and do you think that's impacted in some way? Has that got in the way? This is a really bare question, and it's literally a question. When I see that amazing actor who's got that, he made that documentary, and the documentary is called "I Am Not Your Negro," and the connotations that word has in our history.
I'm just going to start out by saying it's interesting you mentioned that, because immediately what comes to mind is sort of the novelty of vaudeville and minstrelsy and in the history of America. And I think there's maybe in some ways been, having that word attached to it, a Negro spiritual or symphony, maybe in the minds of the greater public, especially during the time we're talking about in the early 20th century, late 19th century, there was a certain kind of appeal to a largely white audience when they see that word,
Really?
Yes, I mean, just from the history, at least in America, with minstrelsy, I mean, it was entertainment, it was something that you went to see from that standpoint. I'll just start out.
Could I just ask you one other question? Because I heard a radio debate yesterday morning where they were debating things like Golliwogg's Cakewalk. It wasn't even a classical music program. It was a London conversations program, and they were talking about and I mean, they were saying that Black people wrote those pieces and did these funny walks to mimic how they thought white people walked. Is that true? Is that a fact?
Yes.
Okay.
Out of slave culture, the cakewalk, that was part of their leisure culture. And so they were mimicking what white culture was.
Right. And
it becomes it's altered. It becomes grotesque in the notion of minstrelsy. And that grotesqueness is intensified by the fact that by the 1890s, Black performers are dominating minstrelsy to a point that white performers are exiting and going into vaudeville. And so, when you look at the earliest film, clip of from a minstrel show that shows Black dancers doing the cakewalk, that it's a paradox that is happening in that. In fact, that you have something that was organic and part of the culture then being siphoned through the lens of popular culture, and it loses what its true essence is, and it becomes a grotesque version of itself that is used even more to emphasize white supremacy, right? Okay. But I think the whole notion of Negro, we have to understand that Negro was a part of the lexicon, and that is how people identified themselves. And so this is just my opinion, and I can't wait to hear others weigh in. I'm just going to say this briefly. The placing of that in the titles of these pieces was also an acknowledgement of how Black people fit into this concept of Americanness. And let's remember that the composers, that many of them who wrote this, were also modeling nationalism as it was being defined in Europe and trying to be defined through America in that post-romantic aesthetic, right? Or late romantic aesthetic. So the notion of composing a Negro folk spiritual is not so different from when Amy Beach composes the Gaelic symphony, right? Because she's representing her consciousness. For us, that dual consciousness, right, has deeper implications than it did for Amy Beach in 1897, right? But it's the same notion of expressing identity, nationalistic, you know, aspects of music. And I'll be quiet.
Well, I just know, for example, when I came across Ignatius Sancho, who was taken to England as a boy slave in the 1700s, and he ended up being he managed to escape. He was being treated very badly when he got into his teens. I think he was a cute, sort of like a curio, cute little black boy, and he was owned by these three sisters in the Greenwich borough of London. And then when he got into the sort of gangly teen years, they started to treat him badly and beat him and threatened to send him to the Caribbean, where he hadn't come from the Caribbean, he'd come from West Africa. He ran and banged on the next sort of mansion house and was taken in by Lord Buccleuch, who they took him under their wing. He learnt music, he learnt to write. He was incredibly eloquent. He wrote books. He wrote beautiful minuets and dances, and then he was freed. And they set him up with enough money to have a shop in London. And if you were a professional person, you were allowed to vote. This is 18th century. He became the first black person in England to be allowed to vote. And there's actually a portrait painting of him by Gainsborough, who was one of the very famous artists of the time. But the music that I've seen that he's written, I saw it in the British Museum when I was making a BBC broadcast series on undiscovered musicians, underplayed composers. And every single piece that he'd written, it was all in hand manuscript. It said that there was a stamp in the front page that said, written by an African. His name did not appear anywhere at all. And apparently that was quite a cute, charming thing. But of course it's belittling as well. And his name was nowhere to be seen. And that sort of hurts me, because we have to keep saying his name because of who he was and what he did. So I just want to throw out another question, if that's okay.
Can I chime in really quickly before we move on? I think both what Tammy and you were sharing about how we identify ourselves, or how we are identified, is really, really important in this conversation. And I think that there is a lot of likely diasporic nuance that also plays into the colonial histories, the nationalist histories, and how this happens. But when we're thinking about how people are employing the word Negro in their compositions, I think it's important to remember, for Black American composers, by choice and by circumstance meaning Jim Crow, they are a part of Black community. They are not off someplace separate from. So they are participating in Black churches, civic organizations, schools, all of that. And what I mean by pointing that out is there's this whole notion coming out of the late 19th century into the 20th century of racial uplift, right? Of people coming out and saying, I am a race man, I am a race woman. And that cuts across, that's true for composers, that's true for academics and professors, politicians, people. That is a way that people talk about themselves and say, I am deliberately doing things to uplift the race, to promote the best of the race. And classical music sits at the very center of that whole ideology in the late 19th century, 20th century. So then using a term which to us is like cringy now, understandably so, Negro, is in fact the opposite at that time. It is a bit of an emblem to assert that, yes, I may be using this classical music tradition, but I am still advocating for and promoting our own cultural tradition.
Absolutely accept and understand what you're meaning now, but it's like but I struggle with, the only thing I struggle with is if I say to somebody, right, I'm just about to play a piece for you on this radio program by the Black, we live in such a visual world that if you put a visual image into someone's head, they're going to possibly listen to it differently and immediately judge it and expect it to be lesser. And that's the thing that concerns me. I think that's a major factor that does concern me. I mean,
sorry.
Sorry, carry on.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to add to that once you were done, Chi-Chi. Sorry.
Well, I do. I would, listening to this, I mean, I feel so much more empowered to put those titles back. Why should I? It's this sense of discomfort, I suppose, because of the connotations, and it makes me feel concerned and grief-stricken in a way because of the way these people were treated, and that they, and who else is playing their music apart from us? And I want that music to get out there, and we're pumping it out the whole time. And I don't want, and I just want, listen to it first, learn about it later, just hear the music. That's what I'm trying to do.
And I think just that, so a couple of things come to mind, and one is that, of course, this isn't just for music and for classical music, the terminology of Negro, and we have examples like UNCF, like the United Negro College Fund, right? And so I think that there can be a balance where now over a decade ago or whatever, UNCF, the United Negro College Fund, evolved to UNCF, and so not necessarily specifically utilizing the word, but still maintaining and understanding the legacy. In other words, not eliminating the letter. And I think that that's important, that we don't, as our sensitivities and our understandings of identity evolve, that we don't at the same time erase or try to ignore history, but rather incorporate it and move forward. And of course, in especially hip hop and other things, and being a great appreciator of Tupac and all of that, if you will, the full-on N-word, right, has absolutely been was able to be taken and utilized in much different ways, in artistic ways by our community. And so I think that there are ways to understand how the connotation and the implications of the word may evolve, but still to not either erase that or separate that history that's there, and how that does how that is associated with the history of the work itself.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's so important. I'm learning so much as well, because we're over here and we don't have these incredible pieces, and we're playing it as much as we can, and finding our way to be heard constantly. And when you look at the question of who belongs in classical music industry, we could simply approach it through the supply and demand on the marketplace. And we see that reggae and all of these things just get grabbed immediately, and because they're popular, people want that music, and there's we've been told for centuries that Black, Asian, ethnically diverse people are just not good enough. We didn't have the talent to be part of the classical music market, and why should they bother to put any energy into developing Black classical musicians? What is them? Who wants to see them? There's been that sort of sense of feeling, because why are we still in this situation? Well, you've got, I think, 1.8% in your orchestras. We've got 1.6 or 7% in our orchestras. It's simply too poor. There's an assumption that Black composers' music is too light, too lightweight. Like Coleridge Taylor, they put Coleridge Taylor's music in the British light music department, and we are too high risk and investment. And so, but we know that the market decides, where the demand is. And so despite kind of the hostile, discriminatory environment that we can find ourselves in, there's still Black artists who do break through. Look at, huge impact of people like Jesse Norman, Willard White, and various people like that. And we've got Sheku right now. And it's their duty. I mean, they carry huge responsibility on their shoulders as the new talent, to show the way for everybody else. But I think that's too much pressure on individuals, and that's why orchestras like Sphinx and Chineke are so important, because that's all to do with exceptionalism, which I'd like you to talk about a little bit as well. That most of the Black artists that I know that have jobs in the States, they're in top jobs, and they are the exceptional, like Billy Hunter and Weston and Anthony McGill and Damari McGill and Andrew Brady and those guys. And we all know that in our wonderful orchestras, and if you think about it, all of those people, apart from the man you mentioned earlier, the violinist from the New York Phil years ago, the first African American,
Sanford Allen.
Sanford Allen. All of those people who won their jobs without being seen were exceptional, are exceptional. And when you think about it, all of those string players who sit in the tutti sections of all the orchestras, probably that person who's been sitting number 7 viola for 30 years in whatever orchestra, probably the last time anyone heard them or they heard themselves was 35 years ago when they did an audition. But the people who are winning the top principal jobs are some of our Black brothers and sisters. And this is the whole thing about how we have to be twice as good and exceptional just to get a job. And I'd like to. This is what we observe from over the pond, and why are the ranks of the orchestras not filled with, there are wonderful players in the orchestras, and you have to be, above average, excellent player. But where does the line? Why does it change when you're Black and you're seen in an audition? We have to wait to be legitimized and let in by our white counterparts. How are we going to change that?
So, well, there's a whole lot in that question for sure, Chi-Chi. Well, a couple things that I would comment on. One, this relates to a host of things, including the environment of auditions, the structure, the framework, including screened auditions, partially screened auditions, et cetera. And some of this, there's actually been a series of articles in the New York Times, and I think the latest one either came out yesterday or today, and a number of musicians who you mentioned, Anthony McGill, Afa, obviously it's Sphinx, and others Weston were quoted and sharing a variety of opinions. And so what I think is interesting is that like all things too, our community is not monolithic in how we think about these things and or how we think what the best solutions are, for sure. But I would say that to respond to your question, Chi-Chi, that there is certain aspects of complexity in certain things. So in a lot of staffing positions with orchestras, I believe that there is not very much complexity, and not that the positions themselves aren't complex, but the way in which to impact hiring and the diversity, especially when you have positions that on average often are 2 to 3 year tenures, that you can absolutely implement systemic approaches of recruitment, hiring, and all sorts of things to bring about a dramatic transition of the diversity of your staff. So oftentimes when I'm talking with orchestras and they're like, oh, well, we want to be diverse, but no Black people show up to our auditions, what can we do? We post and they come. If they come, they come. If they don't, right? And of course, so I start off and I'm like, okay, well, because on stage is a little bit more complex, but let's just start with your staff and your board and your budgets, of which there is no tenure, and there are short-term actual lengths of tenure in terms of the position, people being in those positions. And then I say, for example, do you think if, Coca-Cola is looking to, looks and realizes that only 3% of the people drinking Coke are Black, and that 99% of their staff is white, that they are going to go, oh, should we change this? But you know what? No Black people show up to our interviews, right? Obviously, no entity or organization runs that way. And that's one of the things that I share with orchestras, is that while we are in the field of artistry, orchestras are businesses. When they run out of money, they go out of business. It doesn't matter how artistic they are. And so they have to run as a business. And when you think about your human resources that are creating your art and so on and so forth, you can think about those things. So there is this staffing thing. Now on stage, I think there is this complexity that relates to a host of things. Sometimes people like to say, you know what, there is just only inherent racism, and that is the sole reason for this problem. And if people who were hiring, if the audition committees were not racist, orchestras would just look differently. I don't think that is the case, and that wouldn't solve the problem. So there are a host of different aspects that go along with it. Is there a history of racism amongst hiring an orchestra? Is there a history of literal exclusion? Of course, and absolutely. So how can we put in things that might address that? Some people believe that fully screened auditions, because people like to talk about it, but the screens for the most part come down in the latter rounds. So they really aren't screened, even though people like to think that they're fully screened. So that's one. Some people think screens would be good. Some people think screens are okay and helped address gender disparity, but have not done the same. Then there's also aspects to the underlying pool where we have to actually get to what is happening often through systemic racism that is preventing access and exposure at an early age, which affects the pool and all of that. So whenever orchestras or any entity or even schools are talking about this issue, I often start to delve into that, and then that is followed up by, so we clearly understand this is a complex issue that has a host of various solutions. What solutions are you actually employing? And number two, how much money are you budgeting for it? Because if you're sharing with me that you care about this issue, but you aren't actually doing anything organizationally about it, and you aren't putting or committing any percentage of your budget to it, you don't care about it. And that is a huge reason why we have such incrementalism occurring.
Yes, and gosh, we need another hour to talk about this, but unfortunately,
sorry for going on.
2 minutes, and I think I'm being urged to get on to some Q&A from our audience. So I'm not sure how we get the questions sent over, but they're bursting to send us some questions. So Michael, are you going to help us here, or? But I want to just thank everybody so much from where we've got to now. I mean, there's just never enough time, is there, for these discussions? What would you say to someone who believes the reason for the lack of performances of Black composers' music is that there just aren't enough great Black composers? Now there's a question. Oh God.
Well, again, I mean, how do we know if someone's great unless they are heard?
Yeah, who decides who's good and who's?
Simple.
It's not like running the 100 meters. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, to help clarify the whoever's posing the question, that that you have to understand why is certain music being performed, and then from that you can extrapolate what those reasons are. So what is the curation process taking place that determines which composers are being performed? And that can potentially help you to understand, because pretty much like all arts, it is not always, as of course we all know, the person who actually sings the best is not the most well-known singer who sells the most records. The person who, is the best. We all know soloists, for example, in the classical music field, who may not be the best technical soloist, but who may be getting the most concerts or having the most, gaining the most revenue. So you have to look at what are the various factors that went into that process.
Being in the right place at the right time. comes into it in lots of people's cases. Next question. Can the story of Chevalier de Saint-Georges and his music be a role model going forward for the next generation of curricula? Because we're just about to have a new film, aren't we? That's being made in Los Angeles, from what I know. We could give the thumbs up for that, or? I mean, this guy was seriously pushed to one side. What a genius. Yeah,
And I think that those types of films, I think when we see subject matter such as this move into our current popular culture, it provides us an ample opportunity to have these larger conversations, right? And so when we think about what the movie Amadeus did for classical music, whether it was correct or not, right? Like let's just take that off the table, like, and talk about the fact that what that movie did was it made a topic and a music that for many people weren't accessible, right? And so that's this conversation has to be multi-directional in many ways, and I'm glad we have all of these voices represented, right? Because we do need to speak to people through popular culture. We need to speak to them in the concert hall. We need to speak to them in museum spaces and podcasts, right? But oftentimes we get situated on what I like to call our intellectual monuments. And so and I and they need to be challenged just as much as the physical monuments are being challenged right now, right? So we think that they must happen through certain methods or certain mediums, right? If it's not happening in a scholarly space in journal articles, I'm gonna put on my music historian hat right now, then that's not valued in the merit system of the academy. So as a scholar, I'm not going to write for an entity that's going to broaden the audience and educate the audience. I'm going to have this conversation that's only amongst a small population, and it's utilizing a language that makes the topic even much more inaccessible. And so I think what we have to begin to do it in places like Oberlin and Miami University and Harvard and these places where we train is that we have to broaden our message to say that we need to engage with the public in a very different way. I witnessed Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra did a concert of American music. It was all Black composers. It was packed.
Says a lot.
It was packed,
yeah.
Right? But people wanted to hear Florence Price's piano concerto. Why? Because the New York Times wrote about Florence Price.
The concerto in one movement.
Yes.
Incredible.
They played that. They played Duke Ellington's Harlem. They played William Grant Steele. So what you see is that if there is a collective effort amongst many people, composers need to talk to historians need to talk to musicians and composers, we need to start having broader conversations. And this is where I'm going to make a selfish plug for the Society for American Music. And y'all just excuse me, because I'm going to make a selfish plug. Because one of the things as president and one of the organizational thrusts of us is to have these conversations so that the curator, the publisher, the composer, the community-minded activists, right, can all come together in our conference, in our collective, and tell us, how do we promote American music? And not American music in the domestic United States, but in the sense of South America, North America, the Caribbean, Central America, right? And so, I'm making that plug not because I just want people to come, but I want people to understand we're trying to have a conversation. But we can't have that conversation if people don't know to come.
Yeah.
If people don't know the table is open, right? And so there's all these different mechanisms out there, but oftentimes we're not communicating succinctly with one another. And so we can achieve much more if we get out our silos.
I think we can. I think we've got time for one more question. Then I might throw a little suggestion out. Is there, in fact, almost leads on from what you've just been saying, Tammy. Is there a way, this is the question, is there a way to achieve racial justice by reforming the traditional orchestral model? Or does it require dismantling and rebuilding it?
I'll just say I think there's obviously some kind of reform that needs to take place about what is valued
Yes.
in Western music. In fact, I saw something that it's actually being debated quite a lot online right now. It's a YouTube video by a man named Adam Neely, and he's talking about music theory and basically how there's systemic racism in how music theory is taught. And you could, instead of saying music theory, you could say simply 18th century harmonic language, right? And so that's sort of the basis on how most people value what music is or isn't, at least in sort of like the Western tradition. So I think it's so important for all of us as practitioners, say as a performer, to be able to look at other traditions and other ways of expressing musical language outside of just the common practice era.
Well, there's been a lifetime of discrimination that's led up to this and where we still are today, in actual fact. And so there's nothing new in certain ways, because I still feel we have a way to go. And if we make a point, for example, you know, where you're talking about value, who has the authority over what is considered to be valuable? If you know, and this goes as far as how we hold our auditions. You know, if we make some orchestras are trying to make a point of not discriminating, and is that enough to make our field ideal? I mean, you know, what would make it ideal? If we change what we consider is valuable, for example, because some orchestras are talking about perhaps, you know, if you've got 5 in the finals for an audition, and then they start to say, okay, we need you to be a great member of the community, that becomes a new factor of winning the job. Whereas we're all quite obsessed with, or we have become obsessed with, meritocracy. And now I know that some orchestras are beginning to bring these other aspects in. And, you know, so as another factor for winning a job, is that acceptable? Some people are going for it. Other people feel, no, I want to be you know, if I'm the best player, I want to know that I've won my job because I'm the best player, as well as being black, not just, you know. So there's a sort of, I know there's a two-way thing about this, and because our current system really only values brilliance on the stage. Is that enough? And if so, why should it be?
I think the answer is partly in what the comments you just gave, in the sense that if we are, and I don't think we need to burn it down and start all over. That's not what I think at all. But in that reimagining, it isn't only about the musicians on the stage and in the pit. It is about those administrators and those managers who get to institute those protocols and processes and all of those things, who bring a different life experience and knowledge into the room so at every level of performance organizations, there is a diversity of people in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of age, really thinking about how we bring all of this together to ensure that our ensembles are representative of the communities in which we live, or are aspirational to the world that we would like to see. And so going back to Tammy's point about, you know, kind of looking at it holistically, and not having such a siloed approach to it, but people who really walk and live and breathe these experiences at every level of these decision-making processes, then I think we start to see diversity that doesn't feel like tokenism, but is actually representative, which is, I think, the kind, if we're talking about racial justice and we're thinking about equity, those are the kinds of decisions that help get us there.
Yes, thank you.
Just a quick add-on to that too, as well. That I do not believe that the audition process or that there is a pure meritocracy in American orchestras today. Just like when people say, oh, well, someone, whatever you get on the SAT, you either get a higher grade or a lower one. It's all purely your merit, what you know, and that should get you into college, is of course ignoring all of the other factors that went into that SAT score. And in orchestras, it's even, I would think, in certain ways more profound. The equivalent of legacies for colleges, you have tenure. So the minute that at least a third or more of every orchestra is tenured in there and not going through the audition process, it absolutely is not. There are different reasons. And if you trace back those tenured positions to a time when there was outright exclusion or racism in hiring into orchestras, then by definition, there is a racial component to the membership of that orchestra that has nothing to do with merit.
Yes, I know. And this is, it's a sad fact. And where are, I think we need to get a lot of things boil down to money. I mean, it's hard. I don't like the word really, but, donors need to get involved. It's like football clubs in England, all the donors, they're not interested in, there's no management or, who are ethnic, but most of the best teams are full of Black players. If donors are involved and they hold their organizations accountable, if they don't diversify, we need to get donors involved in that, because money speaks. It's a great shame. And I think, we need to be able to say that Black Lives Matter in every sense of the way. And we'll just keep on keeping on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I feel absolutely blown away by all of you. I'm knocked out. I'll be awake now for hours. And I want to thank you all, Aaron, Tammy, Fredara. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to have spent this time with you. And thank you for everybody else who joined us and listened. And keep the questions coming. I'm sure we can answer by email. Thank you,
Chi-Chi, for moderating and being such a great, and for your work as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Unfortunately, our US tour got lost because of COVID, but we're coming in 2022 now. So look out for us. We'll see you then.